Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Dream Theater, titled The Astonishing. Okay, so maybe Dream Theater was going back to their concept album days. I've been wrong before, I can own up to that. But just so the rest of you all have context here, my channel's gotten approximately 17 times bigger than the last time I talked about Dream Theater in a review. When I covered their self-titled album in 2013, I made the comment that Dream Theater seemed to be charting a new direction, at least in terms of how they thematically structured their albums. They were a little bit looser, a little bit more song-driven, and that made a certain amount of sense. Self-titled record was considered a return to form, charting a very new era for the band. But let's get real here. It was only a matter of time before Dream Theater returned to the well of a narrative-driven concept album. Hell, Metropolis Part 2 Scenes from Memory, which you can make the convincing argument was their best album, was a narrative-driven concept album, and that was 17 years ago, so why not try again? Well, they definitely did. A double album, over 2 hours, with a full symphonic backing orchestra and dystopian narrative, but unlike on Metropolis, frontman James LaBrie was going to be playing all 7 main characters. By all accounts, this is one of the most ambitious projects Dream Theater had ever attempted, and with the full support and budget of the label behind them, you had all the reasons in the world to believe that this could be something really special, from veterans with over 20 years in the industry. So I checked out The Astonishing and gave it a couple of listens, and that took a long time. Did they pull it off? Well, I'm of a few minds when it comes to this project. The most immediate being that superb musicianship, some stunning arrangements, and Dream Theater making one of the most expensive sounding and epic records of their career that deserves immediate acclaim. And yet, after 4 or 5 listens through this behemoth of an album, I'm more convinced than ever that it should be a lot more memorable and powerful than it is. It's most certainly good, and die-hard Dream Theater fans will adore it, but I'm not quite certain it's great or around their best, and that all the creative decisions behind this project paid off as well that the band might have hoped. So let's start off by talking about something that I don't normally discuss much when I talk about albums. Structure. And the first thing that I put into consideration is that thanks to the high concept and the size of this thing, and the 2-act structure and the usage of repeating musical motifs and style of production, it's more of a rock opera musical than anything else. Seriously, bring in more singers to fill out the cast, and I could see this working on stage pretty well, which means that I'm willing to be a little bit more forgiving for the album's length. But at the same time, though, it's certainly an album that takes its time, and the similarities and melodic progressions from song to song with the extremely polished production style means that there's a fair few songs that kind of blur together and don't really have a unique instrumental identity to stand as their own songs. It's certainly nowhere close to being as heavy as Dream Theater has been in the past, which I guess makes a certain amount of sense as this is the first time they've really used a full orchestra, but it also means that a certain amount of visceral power is sacrificed as well. A particular note is considering that this is a record that's set in the future that features noise robots. There's very little usage of sci-fi effects or harsher industrial synthesizers or more electronic elements that would indicate we're over 200 years in the dystopian future. In fact, given the occasional sound effects that do show up, that seem more sword and sorcery driven, you could easily argue the only thing that puts this album in the future is the noise robots, as this record doesn't really do much in the details of the fact that it's set in the future of the United States. And maybe it's just having heard far more abrasive music over the past few years, but the noisy interludes, they weren't that bad at all. Almost a little bit too sanitized. They don't sound that grating to me. Now, none of that is saying that on a compositional level that there aren't melodies or passages that aren't potent or have real swell to them. The rapid instrumental change-ups on Dystopian Overture, the glossy synth and keyboards on When Your Time Has Come, the insane guitar and keyboard interplay that opens up A Life Left Behind, and the fantastic solos on A New Beginning to that gorgeous ragged fiddle on Hymn of a Thousand Voices. And the power ballads on this album really are damn great. The piano-driven Act of Faith that explodes into a much darker song with some excellent drum work, the gorgeous Chosen with probably one of my favorite hooks on this album, even the fragmented song The Answer was excellent. It's just that the actual metal elements, they feel softened to the point where it doesn't give the conflict or the villains on this album the sort of bite they need to seem truly menacing. 3 Days, prime example, where the thread is completely undercut by a swing-inspired piano line and brassy horns that feels just a little bit too comical for me. It gets a little better on the meteor attempting offer, or the more violent The Path That Divides, or the opening riff on A New Beginning that has some good snarl to it before getting submerged in the rest of the mix. But part of the problem then comes in the usage of that orchestra. You can definitely tell that John Petrucci doesn't quite have the knack for producing for that larger choir of voices, and it often feels like they're just a shade short of the swell that really drive them home with that epic power. It also shows up in the mix balancing. The guitars feel a shade too polished and lacking in grit, the bass is a little lacking in texture or meat when you can hear it at all, and the drums not quite having the punch they need to hit with real impact, with the slightly more faded cymbals not helping at all. And a big part of all this is the vocals too. Look, I'm not going to deny that James LaBrie sounds great on this album, and I can appreciate the Herculean effort it took to try and make distinctive and emotive voices for all the characters that he's playing, but it's not like they go for extensive multi-tracking or anything beyond a few filters to distinguish them all that much further, which can make songs where the point of view changes between character to character kind of hard to follow. And yet, for as expensive and big as this album can sound, I'm left wondering why they didn't just hire a few guest singers to play these parts, if only to add more distinctive voices to the choir. They don't even need to be big names if you're so terrified of the Arion comparison that was gonna give me it anyway, given some of your synth tones, and I'm almost certain they would have had the budget for it too. You get some big names behind you, this album would have even sounded bigger and more powerful, even more epic. As it is, it makes the story's scope feel smaller by just having James LaBrie sing everybody's part, which is the last thing that this album needs. Cause, let's be honest here, this is high fantasy camp, with the story midway between your average young adult dystopian novel and your archetypal hero journey. And for a high concept musical, that can work. Hell, it's pretty much the only place where if you play it straight, you can get away with how cheesy it all is, provided you go as over the top epic as possible. And yet, even with that, Dream Theater's pushing it here. I can push out how painfully on the nose the symbolism is, even in the characters' names, or how the lyrics are often comically broad, or how the concept of returning music to the world feels like a rejected Disney script, but I'm willing to play along to a point. But it doesn't help matters that Petrucci's trying to give moral ambiguity to every single character, which feels both over-explained and kind of thinly sketched. It's probably most exasperating with the villains, the tyrant who uses noise robots and threatens mass slaughter. He's really just misguided and scared to embrace the music that he's always loved deep inside. And his name is the creatively misspelled Nefarious. Even the brother of the princess who kills the brother of our hero out of jealousy/daddy issues. A hero, by the way, is named Gabriel for a healthy dose of biblical symbolism, and who mortally wounds his own sister. He's only deafened before getting his own forgiveness. And on the topic of that mortal wounding, we might as well talk about the pretty thin plot, how much of this album obsesses over it. It compels our hero to let loose such a deafening scream that he loses his voice, which I'd buy, except LaBrie's scream is really quite weak here, not all that impressive, and yet is somehow so strong that it calls people from all around the world, and they literally sing our princess back to life. Yeah, this Disney death is only marginally less ridiculous as when it happened on Rent, and I don't like it for the exact same reason. It's a tension-destroying element, and does nothing for the stakes of the story if the power of song and music can beat death. And considering that the atmosphere is already pretty thin on this album, overstretched really, it's probably the point that pushes this album away from the true greatness that it could have had for me. So yeah, in the end, look, I can respect Dream Theater taking a chance to try something in this vein. Frankly, I'm amazed they haven't tried it sooner, but I'm not as grabbed by it as I want to be. The compositions themselves are gorgeous, but stretched over 2 hours of music that's not as well produced as it could be, and with a story that never really manages to transcend the camp of it all, I find myself wishing for what might have been, especially when said ideas would have been easy enough to execute to the point where you realize that they didn't and there's no good reason for it. Especially when you place this album up against Dream Theater's best works. I'm sorry, for me it's a strong 7 out of 10 and a recommendation, but a slightly cautious one, and I honestly don't see myself revisiting this album much more in the future. I mean, I applaud the ambition, but I find myself wishing that Dream Theater had continued on the path that I predicted when I reviewed their self-titled album. It might not have been astonishing, but it would have been leaner, tighter, and probably better for it. Just saying. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Yeah, I can imagine this is going to be a controversial opinion, especially as a lot of hardcore Dream Theater fans probably adored this album. Look, I liked it, but I wanted to like it more, that's all. But until then, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Just give me some time, the schedule for February is already piling up. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.